I'm Aaron. I'm from the University of Michigan. I'm a research fellow in psychiatry. I'm going to present the self-mockingly titled Idiot SAVaNT Study, Injection Drug-Related Infection Observation-Based Treatment, Systematically Advancing Vital and Novel Therapies. Now, I've never seen Shark Tank, but I'm really excited to be here. When I told my day-to-day mentor, who's a PhD statistician, that I was doing the Lion's Den, he said, that's weird. Why did they name it after a adult bookstore that markets itself to long-haul truckers? I have no idea. So my project summary, I'm talking about some pretty high-risk stuff here. So we all know bacterial infections frequently complicate IV or injection drug use. Treatment adherence in these patients is challenging due to their underlying substance use disorders and comorbid mental health disorders, and they frequently leave against medical advice. Outpatient treatment of IV-related infections with parenteral antibiotics is obviously a concern when I suggest it to anyone, because most of us, as emergency physicians, are going to assume these patients will tamper with their PICC lumps. So the goals of this project were to improve treatment compliance and treatment outcomes using an ED observation unit-based program for the expedited consultation care of these patients, meaning kind of getting surgery, ID, your PICC team, and social work and psych on board to try to basically get these patients in and out of the institution as possible, with the kind of goal of reducing the likelihood that they'll leave AMA before their hospital course, but with the understanding that we're actually maybe sending these patients home with outpatient parenteral antibiotic therapy. So the aims specifically, so one was to kind of estimate the burden of injection drug-related infections in my emergency department through chart review, looking at the past year prevalences of your soft tissue, deep space infections, bacteremia, endocarditis, osteoseptic arthritis, most common serious complications of IV drug use, and then to look at the leaving against medical advice rates and kind of when and where that happens, and looking at some patient outcomes. Second part was to determine the feasibility of this idea by doing some surveys and semi-structured interviews of the requisite stakeholders, including kind of on the technical side, on the consultant side, and then kind of looking at some of the barriers to care, because as I said, I think most of us think, oh, that's a crazy idea to send an IV drug-using patient home with a PICC line, and then actually talking to the patients who are injection drug users, and also very importantly, talking to your ED and other hospital staff about what their kind of expectations and perceptions are around this and what expertise they might be able to provide. The third aim would be to actually develop this protocol and determine, and again, I'm not sure precisely how to do this, but to try to figure out whether this would be valid. I think the first part is getting over the ethical hurdle. So I actually changed this like 2 hours before it was due to make it the first piece, which would be a bit expensive, prospective cohort study, actually comparing people with injection drug and non-injection drug related infections to each other, and then doing some intention to treat and following very carefully those patients who use injection drugs who end up going home with the parenteral antibiotics, and setting up some type of Vancouver type model with community care. So you had some type of safety net while you're going through this. And then, of course, I think this is probably not going to be feasible and it would be terribly expensive. But the part of the third aim was to actually do an RCT where you randomize people to routine care versus outpatient parenteral antibiotics. That's kind of the even more crazy part of a crazy idea. So why is this important? Well, we're in the third major opioid crisis. The first was in the 4th century Mesopotamia, when Lugar the shepherd first cultivated the opium poppy for use and brought it to a ritual animal sacrifice, during which time everyone got a little loopy. They lost 38 goats and were punished with 8 years of famine. The second opioid crisis was in the 1967 when avant-garde rock pioneer Lou Reed came out with his single, Heroin. So the third crisis began when we started giving, OxyContin, Percocets, and Vicodin to everybody. I think most of your patients probably looked like this when we put them on ES back in the 90s. And of course, we know that the crisis is worsening. I think everyone's seen this graph. Prescription opioid deaths still climbing despite decreased prescribing, and heroin and fentanyl are off the charts. We know going back into, sorry, this got cut off, but this is a journal paper from the 70s looking at Brigham and Women's, and basically it says that people who use injection drugs lead AMA. You guys might have seen the New York Times article about cardiothoracic surgeons refusing to treat patients with recurrent endocarditis and needing valve repair. There's one small study of 29 people who went through an OPAT program, an outpatient parenteral antibiotic program in Singapore with IV drug use, and there was no deaths and only a couple of cases of tampering. So this will, I think the feasible part of actually the study is to, who am I? I'll just say, I'm Aaron, I'm a fellow, I trained with Goldfrank, I have a master's, and I did an addiction fellowship, and I work at Hurley. And the cheap part will be the chart review, and the expensive part would be actual any prospective study. Randomized control trial cost $1 million, that's it. Sorry.
Yeah, this is Craig Newgard. So I think this is an interesting idea. I'm probably not the right person to mentor you for this, but I guess one piece that I was surprised to not see on there is some integration of drug addiction treatment. You know, we heard yesterday
that's because the buprenorphine piece, which is actually a critical part, that's actually what I'm building around in terms of integrating like mobile health technologies and telemedicine into an ED-based buprenorphine treatment. That's what I'm actually going to do as an R21 or a K. This was a kind of a, I don't want to say throwaway, this was a very risky idea that I don't think anyone would be necessarily interested in funding, that would be a component of a larger ED-based harm reduction program. So I left out the buprenorphine piece only because I'm saving it for the actual grant that I'm working on. But buprenorphine, but realistically, if I were going to do this, it would have to be integrated into, I think, two models. One is ED-based buprenorphine, another care, but it's also a harm reduction model. So it's trying to take into account for the fact that a lot of patients are still not going to be willing or able to comply or complete therapy initially, which means that realistically, I think once you actually put the buprenorphine and other harm reduction interventions in place, including like syringe exchange, in the emergency department, you're actually going to, I'm hoping that you'll actually be left with so few of these patients that you won't actually be able to get valid and to make any valid comparisons. But I think as part of like an R01 type study of an ED-based harm reduction model, you could integrate this as a subset. And the other thing is, which is why I kind of changed the way I did it, was I think you could also sell, if you just came up with an observation unit-based protocol for getting your patients who are going to end up needing long-term parenteral antibiotics, whether or not it was from injection drug use, in and out faster and show that it's cost saving, then once you demonstrate that, then you can go back and kind of look at your injection drug cohort, especially when you set up the second part, which was the first part being buprenorphine and the second part being a Vancouver-style community care model, and then look at that more specifically.
Yeah, I think that's true. I guess I'd probably favor integrating, you know, SAVaNT or other of the addiction-based treatments up front into this,
absolutely.
Because otherwise I think you're treating a symptom of a larger disease. And so this is sort of an opportunity. Like these, you know, patients come in the ED for a variety of reasons, but this is one of them. So when you capture them in the ED, that's sort of a captive audience to potentially intervene not just on the infection, but also on, you know, the underlying reason why they got the infection in the first place. So if you could meld those two ideas.
Absolutely.
And also, I think there's lots of steps before you get to the R01.
Oh, yes.
So, you know, even a pilot trial, you know, may be part of a K or might be beyond a K. So I think there's lots of ways that you collect data that could support a career path, you know, going through a K to R, you know, sort of process that would integrate both those pieces. It would be a nice complement.
Great, thank you.
Vic Barbara again. I'm probably not the guy to mentor you directly, but there's a whole lot in there as far as what you can do. So you might want to, instead of hitting the old pie, maybe just a piece of that. In particular, you know, the randomized trial, I agree with Craig. I mean, that may be an easier area to go in, is funding around that. Right. Do you need to have all these consultants in the OBS unit to take care of these patients? Could you do it? Could you do it as an outpatient in a different program that's outpatient based versus putting them all there? And then there is a rise for drug abuse in oral and insufflated or versus injected. Right. So is that burden of patients going down? I don't know about Hurley, other states that I've worked at, and there's some data to reflect that. There's a decrease there of injection patients. So maybe just drug abuse again versus just injection, and that high intensity of all those consultants coming to the obs unit may not be where the money is. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, and I'll just so in actuality, what my goal is, looking at it more comprehensively, is to integrate multiple harm reduction interventions, kind of beginning with the tertiary prevention piece, which is ED-based Suboxone, but including things like syringe exchange, which is also part of a program that teaches people how to reduce the risk of infectious diseases by using clean works, essentially, as we say I used to do like syringe exchange when I was a pre-med student, and because part of the burden too is related to the fact, I think, at least my theory is that we have a lot of relatively novice injection drug users who really don't seem to know what they're doing. Like I actually did, meaning I started taking care of patients who used heroin back in the 90s in Manhattan, and a lot of the people who kind of trained me were veterans of the 60s and 70s heroin culture, and a lot of the 90s folks they tended to be older still, and they kind of knew what they were doing, and they were seeking out those resources because they needed them. A lot of the patients I'm seeing are very young and very new users, and there's not the same culture around injection drug use that you might have had in certain parts of New York in certain eras. So I think a lot of this, honestly, you could probably reduce the harm around injection drug-related infections just by doing things like giving people clean needles and teaching people how to use alcohol wipes, which sounds really simplistic, but that actually prevents a lot of endocarditis.
I'm Lynn Richardson from Mount Sinai. So thank you for a very entertaining presentation. There was so much in here, I hardly know where to begin. But you do have a lot of interesting ideas. It wasn't really clear to me which problem you were trying to solve. It makes a little bit more sense now that you told us. These were sort of a bunch of add-ons to a larger, more comprehensive approach. I think the observational study is going to be really important to characterize how big a problem is this, and is it actually increasing or decreasing? Right. I think the real money is on prevention as opposed to treating these injection drug-related infections. I don't find anything novel about the observation unit to sort of coordinate care. That's really what this is.
Right. The novel piece was the actual sending home patients with a PICC line who are actively using injection drugs.
Yeah, well, that's not the novel piece. That's like the deal breaker piece.
Right.
Just in terms of actually, trying to get this off the ground. I do some work in sickle cell, and we have been trying to gain some traction just on the idea of discharging, competent, reliable sickle cell patients home with PCA pumps.
Right.
And we haven't been able to get that sort of past an IRB or a study section or a fund or
right.
Or even the other physicians who work at our institution, let alone people who are actively drug abusing,
right.
sending them home with IV access. So, and I think you're just trying to be provocative, which is fine. It is a real problem that often these patients do not stay in the hospital long enough to get the recommended course of intravenous antibiotics. Right. Really like to see you sort of use your, obvious superior intellect and imagination to brainstorm something that's doable.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to. I really appreciate that feedback, and my plan is to start with the actual things that are feasible and fundable. But I also wanted to use this forum as an opportunity to highlight one of the very kind of risky and crazy seeming ideas, which if the kind of trajectories with heroin use go the way they are and the related complications do, may not seem as crazy like 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, but my goal is still, I'm always interested in caring for the kind of hardest to reach patients with, yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry.
We have about 30 seconds left in your thing, and I think Dr.
Oh, I'm sorry.
may have a comment.
Yeah, so I'm out, just being blunt, but a few key things. Interesting ideas, provocative. You have lots of imprecise terminology littered throughout here. The term AMA means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Clean that up. Everybody here, since the reason you attended was to learn about this, everybody knows you're supposed to have 3 aims, right? That's what everyone's been told. And one of the 2 magic things about AIM 3 is It has to be doable, and it can't depend on AIM 1 or AIM 2, because if then AIM 1 fails, everybody reviewing grants says, oh my God, this whole thing goes down the drain. Your AIM 3 isn't dependent on 1 and 2, but it's way, way, way beyond,
It's way beyond.
an M3. It's actually an R34. It's the preliminary, could I randomize in this, or could I enroll, or whatever the design is. So that's actually way too much for that third part here, just from a technical perspective.
So do we have any offers on the table at the end of Dr. Dora Laskey's amazingly provocative presentation?
Well, I mean, I would be willing to talk to you, and we actually talked a little bit yesterday about how you might pursue some pieces of this, and a little bit about how to package things into doable projects. This, this is like, a Christmas tree that's sagging under the weight. You put every ornament in the store on it. So, I guess that's an offer just for maybe a consultation to help you think about what's actually doable and where you could go to get money to do some pieces of this.
That'd be awesome.